Okay, so we are going to start this roundtable number 3. So actually, it's a good transition with the roundtable we just had. When we came, from France, trying to understand the specificities of Kenya, there was, of course, this very strong impact of natural disasters and how you prevent, mitigate, and manage disasters. But we noticed in the humanitarian aid system that when you speak about taking in charge or intervening in this context of natural disaster, it is very much often in rural areas or rural settings. Now, it is true that it is a crucial question. The French international NGOs just met in France and trying to understand what are the big questions. And the big question, I think, is here in Nairobi and in Kenya, but it's also for other NGOs. What are we going to do with urbanization? How we are going to tackle and respond to urban vulnerabilities? I think in Kenya, it's a huge challenge, but it's also a huge question in the humanitarian aid system. So for this, to moderate this roundtable, I've got the great pleasure to welcome Olivier Dubois. So Olivier is the head of the regional delegation of the ICRC. I'm very pleased that the ICRC is managing this roundtable because they were one of the first to publish with the ICRC a review on this question as well in conflict settings. Olivier, you also worked for NGOs in Rwanda, in many parts of the world, so you have your great experience of humanitarian action, celebrating actually your 20 years at ICRC this year. And as a French-speaking discussant, we welcome Éloi Fiquet. So Éloi is a professor at the English translation is tricky. The Institute for Advanced Studies, non, c'est pas ça. Le HESS, so translator, please. School for Advanced Studies in Social Science. Yes, so Éloi is also one of our board members because we have 3 academic institutions in our board. And Éloi is a specialist of East Africa, especially Ethiopia. Is an historian and anthropologist and working on many topics. So now I leave it up to you for this roundtable. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really a pleasure for me to be at this session, and the organizer gave me 2 presents. First, to moderate the last session, the latest one. So it's a challenge I'll take with joy, and the other one is to moderate on a topic where I'm not a specialist, and I see it as an advantage, as I can be the Candide de Voltaire, just a tribute to the French Red Cross here. It's clear that we heard today Kenya is urbanizing fast. It's still a rural country, and the previous presentation showed us, but the figures this morning show increasing urbanization, now 31% of Kenyans living in urban city. A particularity is as well that is urbanization and the major cities, in particular Nairobi, are known for their informal settlements or even slums, as some said it, and figures, but I'm not sure I got the evidence right, say that in Kisumu, informal settlements are about 47% of the city population, and Nairobi 36%. So it's quite massive. The challenge, there are different key questions and pointers I would like to give to the panelists today. The first one is the recognition that the humanitarian sector as a whole has been quite slow to adapt to urbanization and to define a way of working that is adapted to those environments, and maybe possibly even more in Africa than elsewhere. The second one is that the discourse on urbanization have been centered from a humanitarian perspective a lot on this informal settlement. Is it legitimate, or is there a form of bias? A bias because informal settlement are opening more easily a humanitarian space. And some have even described some of the work that has been done in Kibra, here in Nairobi, as a form of humanitarian government. It's meaning a place where that operates at the boundaries between state and non-state formation, between universal moral imperative and particular political conflict. So the question here, based with this possible bias, is it legitimate for humanitarian actors to work in urban centers? Is it legitimate to have a discourse centered on informal settlement? Meaning, is the evidence that maybe the scientists will provide us clearly show that this is where the vulnerability lies? Is the humanitarian sector fit for purpose in urban setting? And here, what we've seen recently is either new actors or new alliances. And I will take one example. It's not that I want to put them in the forefront, but it's a group like Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor that has been created with an amalgamation of traditional humanitarian agencies, but also public and private sectors, thinkers, have been devoting a lot of energy in addressing urbanization for the poor, including in Kenya. Is this the model, the future for humanitarian action in urban settlement? The question that have been asked in the previous panel can be asked in this panel. What are the public policies and the role of impact and the impact of the institutional design in Kenya, meaning devolution? What are they fit for purpose to respond to urban vulnerabilities and leaving no one behind, as it's the motto that we hear nowadays? Another important point is clearly that in urban setting, maybe even more than elsewhere, the gender lens is required, as when we see access to services or even exposure to sexual violence, and it's clearly something that has been integrated in the discourse, and I hope in the practice. Then maybe I introduce my own bias before giving the floor to the panelists. I'm an ICRC worker, and I'm just coming from Latin America. And then I have a question about the risk in Kenya and in East Africa in general of the spread of urban organized violence, given what we heard today, youth population with little income opportunities, somehow some problematic law enforcement practice, and an increase of international illicit trade, in particular drugs, at seaport cities. Is East Africa and Kenya at risk of this phenomenon that we have observed somewhere, and it should be a concern for humanitarians or not? Then we'll close this aspect by discussion, and we have one of panelists being there. It's clear that also the appeal and the risk of urbanization is also present for IDPs, migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. As we're talking about transition, Kenya and transiting in that aspect, from a UNHCR-centered refugee status determination to a state one, with all the documentation problem that it carries with, from a camp policy for refugee to the one that is promoted through greater insertion as part of the Global Refugee Compact. And an open question is whether Kenya would become, and Kenyan cities in particular, could become a place of longer transit or even destination for migrant population, and are they ready for that? So these are a few pointers, and I'd like that we start with the first panelist. And let me say a few words, because there's been some change of panelists, not of content, not of organization, but of panelists. And I would like to invite first Mrs. Agathe Wanyoni, who's working for UN Habitat and a specialist on land and land tenure in particular. So she will give us that perspective to start with. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Agatha Wanyonyi, as you've been told. I'm standing in for Omar Sila, who is the leader of Urban Legislation, Land and Governance branch of UN Habitat. And we specifically work with the unit of Land and Global Land Tool Network, which is mandated to deal with land and tenure security under UN Habitat. I'll take you through challenges of rapid urban growth, urban vulnerability from the land perspective, then the global land tool network approach, and lastly, conclusion and takeaways. So on challenges, it's estimated that around 70% of the world's population will be staying in urban areas by 2050. In Africa, right now it's around 40%. By 2050, it should be around 50%. Nairobi has around 10% of the population of Kenya staying here, and with a growth rate of around 4%, which is quite high and rapid. So the challenges arising at the moment include densification of informal settlements. The population there is usually very high. Then we have limited access to basic services. The prices are skyrocketing. Actually, like Upper Hill area is known to have one of the highest prices in the world. Then we have the city extending to the peri-urban areas, and there's increasing vulnerability because of all these aspects. So the Global Land Tool Network looks at urban vulnerability from a land perspective, whereby vulnerability is generally defined as exposure to risk and the inability to be able to avoid or absorb the potential harm. And from the land perspective, it affects mostly the poor, people in informal settlements, IDPs, refugees, and women. And eventually it emerges that the most important asset is land and property rights. And insecure land tenure affects urban dwellers' capacity to adapt to and react to climate change. Usually you find the poor will not be able to afford land, and they will reside in marginal areas like the hilly parts, the very steep areas, the flood plains, the road reserves, and when climate impact comes, they are the most affected. So land is an area that may be neglected when it comes to vulnerability, and we are saying that land is the ground on which cities are built, and it should be something that should be highly considered when making plans. So from GLTN, we look at it in terms of transforming urban vulnerability and resilience through capacity of urban dwellers. And we encourage their participation and using their knowledge to be able to come up with solutions. We also take the view of empowering the most vulnerable in the cities through improving access to land, and also control over land, and also not forgetting the women in these areas. We use a bottom-up approach on land tenure, where we have the fit-for-purpose approaches, which are gender-responsive, they're affordable, and specifically we have the social tenure domain model, which is a land administration software using open source that we have used in many areas to document and improve tenure security and preparation for resilience and vulnerability as we do that. And then we are guided by the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically SDG 11 on sustainable cities, so as to improve housing. And remember, with housing, you must start with land. So just to give an example of some areas we have done, under conflict-related land issues, and this is the area of refugees, we have the Kalobeyei refugee settlement, where we are working together with UNHCR, the county government, and some of our partners on the ground, that is Norwegian Refugee Council, to come up with a way to manage the refugee camp before it loses its ability to manage the land issues. The Kalobeyei refugee settlement is around 25 kilometers from Kakuma, with around 38,000 refugees from various places in Africa. And as the people have settled, it like mirrors an urban setting without the requisite facilities. So our aim is to set up a land information system to support UNHCR and the county government in managing land administration in this area. We don't intend to give titles. Our aim is just to enhance tenure security, that the refugees know exactly what they are allocated, on what terms, and what they can use it for. And the aim is actually to integrate them in the host community. And as we do this, we are also supporting the host community in the area. We are not doing for the refugees only in isolation. Now, we have also done, just a moment, sorry. We have also dealt with informal settlements in Mombasa and Nairobi. I'll concentrate on the Nairobi case, Mashimoni, which is situated around 5 kilometers from the city in Mathare North, with around 2,000 households. What was done is participatory enumeration, together with the relevant government authority and the residents. And then the area was mapped, and the data was collected on tenure. And they are using this data to negotiate with the government authorities on issues like water, toilets, drainage, and even tenure security on how they can be allocated this land. Because it is felt that once they feel secure, they'll be more willing to invest in measures that ensure that they are not vulnerable to the weather and its impacts. And then we are also moving towards the peri-urban areas, because we see the clear link between the urban area resilience and the peri-urban area, because as land in the city becomes too expensive, people are moving to the peri-urban areas. And a lot is going on there. There's a lot of conversion of land use, commodification of land rights, and then the market there is very dynamic. There is no proper planning as subdivisions take place haphazardly, and it is going also to, it is clear that it's going to be an area that will have challenges if the issue is not taken care of. So in that case, oh, sorry, I didn't show. In that case, we have chosen Kajiado County, where a research is being done on sustainable land governance in peri-urban areas to see how to manage this, the nexus between urban and peri-urban, and the dynamics of the land issues that are going on. So in conclusion, it's evident that rapid urban growth is going on in many cities such as Nairobi. And as it goes on, there are many land challenges that are arising. The landless are the most, and the insecure urban dwellers are the most exposed to risk. Land and tenure security are key factors for transforming urban vulnerability. I hope I have been able to convince you in a way about that, and that it is very important to join forces as we work on this. That is the development partners, humanitarian actors. We need to work together to address the land challenges in urban, peri-urban, and the conflict areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Wanyoni. I think it was very clear and focused. Nice transition now. I'd like to call in Dr. Kanyima Mwindi. Dr. Mwindi, as you could read in the paper, she's a researcher at the African Population and Health Research Center. And one key topic of her research nowadays is urbanization and well-being of the population. So I think it's a nice transition. Please, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm kind of going to talk the bigger picture of Africa to what the first speaker has spoken about. And I'll quickly take you through. Okay. The rate of urbanization in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa to be precise, is actually the highest, the least urbanized, but with the highest urbanization rate in the world. And we are estimating that by 2050, we'll hit 1 billion in urban population at the current rate. And that will represent more than 50% of the region's population that will be living in urban areas. And the question is, are our cities really ready for that growth? If we look at sub-Saharan Africa and Africa, we are almost at the same rate, 42%, 42.5% for Africa in general. And implications of urbanization, as cities grow, as people move to cities, we need to be ready to provide housing and decent housing, transport that is efficient, water and sanitation, solid waste management, and food security, and many other things, education, health services. So that's a question we really need to start thinking about as Africans. And the humanitarian side will come as we go along. So that is just a snapshot of how the trend will be in future. We'll overtake the rural population by around 2030. So we need to start getting ourselves ready for a bigger urban population. But I wanted to bring in the issue of forced migrants in cities. 61% of refugees in the world are currently living in urban areas. Most of them are quite invisible, but probably our colleague will tell us whether they are now visible. But most of them tend to be covered because, especially in Kenya, we have policies that want them in the camps. So when you're in Nairobi, then you stay underground, and mostly the nice underground areas you can live in are the slums, where you are a bit out of reach of the police and the government. So now I'll cover the challenges that come with urbanization and that we are already seeing. And that is one of the things that our colleague has already talked about, dense settlements in the form of slums. The orange parts are actually slum, the proportion of urban population that is living in slums in each country in Africa. That's the African continent. And most of us are actually over 50%, so we need to think whether that is where the future of urban living will be, and the slums are also going to be home to forced migrants. Are we ready? Is it the place we want them to live? Is it where we want to target our humanitarian action? The question you asked, I think maybe we'll discuss about that. And we've seen that slums usually bring down the city estimates. When we start looking at health indicators, for example, in Nairobi, when you lump the non-slums and slum areas, then city indicators are actually very diluted. But when you classify them as slum and non-slum, you can see the nice areas are having better indicators. Slums are remaining quite behind. So we need to see whether we need to pull them up, or what we need to do is something that policy needs to come into play. Housing, sorry, the photos seem to have moved. Housing disparities in quality. If you look at that, that's actually a picture of Nairobi. That is Korogosho in the first, this one is Korogosho slums. This, I don't know, it looks like Nairobi high-rise, the slum upgrading. This is a nice area near my office, near Kitisuru. And this is one of the houses that collapsed during some rainy season, I think Huruma. And this is the quality of housing that we have in Nairobi and in many other cities in Africa, and they have implications for the health of residents living in those areas. Someone who is living here is not the same as someone who is living in that house. So something for housing people to think about. Environmental pollution is also another big thing that we can see. Nairobi, I'm sure the visitors in Nairobi, if you found the traffic today, you've wondered whether you've landed in hell or someplace. Because if you look at this is, I think, Uhuru Highway on a bad day. This is a dump site in Dandora. This is a place near the Ngong River in industrial area. And this shows us the cooking fuels that are available to most people in cities, in the poorer areas, that are quite polluting and causing quite a lot of health issues. And this has just some quick statistics, snapshots. 27% of urban households in Nairobi, in Kenya, are using kerosene as a primary cooking fuel. 46 are using charcoal or wood, while 90% of us are living in cities that are polluted, including Nairobi. So something to think about. Access to water. I included some findings from a qualitative study we did in Nairobi among urban refugees. And I just wanted to show that while the map does not show that we are doing so badly, we are around 75% probably in Kenya in terms of access to improved water. But some refugees are really having it rough, where someone has to go to the car wash to get water because they cannot afford the borehole water that is being sold to them because they've run out of money and nobody's bringing water in terms of aid to that person. So, and they're also not wanted in those car washes to fetch that dirty water. So you just wonder then where do they go? Improved sanitation, we are also not doing so badly. Well, not really so well, but there could be quite some improvement to be done in terms of access to unshared sanitation among African populations. And food insecurity, which will get worse as we increase. We had a study that we did in Mukuru, the larger Mukuru slums in Nairobi, and we found that actually most households are in need of food emergency aid because they are just hungry throughout. And I think it's worse for migrants who have no fallback. You see, for me, if I'm hungry, I'll call my brother in the rural areas and he'll send some food. But a refugee who is coming from Congo, I think it's worse for them when they really run out of food. They are in dire straits. And then there's the case of rising NCDs, and I want to include here that mental health is one key issue that we found out in our study, that most forced migrants are really dealing with a lot of stress and trauma, and it's not being captured by the health systems that we have. And we are also having coexisting infectious diseases, so migrant populations increasingly will be coming along with all those conditions, and we need to be ready in the health systems that are receiving them so that we deal with each individual disease or condition as it should be dealt with. And in conclusion, Africa is going to be urban in a few years, actually in 20-something years. Are we really ready? And the urban areas will include refugees and asylum seekers. Are we ready? Are we prepared for systems that are inclusive of those forced migrants so that we can also give them proper, something comparable to what they left back home? And I wanted to underline that we need data because I had a hard time preparing some of this because you don't find much of the data. We need data systems that really put things out there for people to be able to make decisions and for proper programming. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mwindi. I think we got the scene from an African perspective to Nairobi. So now the second part of the intervention are more the humanitarian actors on the ground. So what have they been doing, their challenge? And I'll start with Sarah King. Sarah King is working for the Norwegian Refugee Council. She's regional advisor for livelihood and food security. She's accepted to step in as Kennedy could not make it. She has extensive experience in the region, previously working for Consent. So Sarah, please, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that I'm not Kennedy Mabonga. He couldn't be here, so thank you for allowing me to step in. I probably will repeat a little bit of what's been said, but I think my predecessors have explained quite a lot about the context. I wanted to go into that a little bit and look at how we as humanitarian actors and others responding to people living in urban contexts and urban crises, particularly in Kenya, are ready or not for this. Some of the work that has been done and some of the recommendations and ideas that we perhaps need to take in mind as we go forward trying to deal with this situation. So, where do I point this? Sorry. Which one do I press? That one, thank you. So as we've already heard, the urban context is of a rapidly growing population. Some of the estimates I've heard is that Nairobi itself is set to quadruple in population by 2050. If you look at the population projections for the whole country and then the fact that the city is growing faster than the rest of the country. As we've heard, the settlements where a lot of urban population are living are very dense, they're unplanned, the infrastructure is extremely poor, and there's a very high rate of insecurity, which I think those of us who are fortunate enough not to live in those areas really have no idea how bad it actually is. Poverty is really endemic in these settlements. At least half of the people in these settlements are living below the poverty line, and they become very marginalized because of their status, social status, and so forth. These risks easily tip into a crisis. People don't have a buffer, they're not resilient to shocks, and something that happens can easily tip them over the edge. Then this is easily multiplied when they have additional pressures. For example, some kind of disaster or a sudden population influx. As we've already heard, around the world, displacement is now largely urban. I have 60%, you had 61, roughly those figures are right, around the world of the refugees now live in what is classified as an urban context. There's also in a context of rising inequality, even if we look at Kenya, the growth of the super rich continues while the gap between them and the poor just grows wider and wider. There are also as we heard earlier, it's a shocking statistic really that 70% of the population is under the age of 24. What are they going to do in future? What is their future? What are they going to do for jobs? Where are they going to find the means to look after their families and so forth? There is a real lack of opportunities, and this, as we see in many other countries around the world right now, can lead very rapidly into a kind of an urban crisis, huge demonstrations, that can very rapidly spiral into all kinds of crisis. You also mentioned, Olivier, other types of challenges like organized crime. These may be somehow linked. In terms of urban displacement, we know something, but there are still information gaps. We know it's happening, but I think we are not really sure at the more regional and local and even global levels. We don't really know exactly how big this issue is. To what extent are cities providing safe havens for the internally displaced? How well are they doing at adapting? And how does displacement and other crises shape urban life and the way that cities are generated? The IDMC, which is the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, kind of a department of NRC, has a thematic research series at the moment looking at urban displacement in the 21st century, which is ongoing, and it's producing quite a number of interesting reports and analyses from different urban contexts around the world. So I recommend looking at that. In terms of us as humanitarian agencies, we are not really set up for this. I think our response analysis frameworks, our assessments, the way we're set up is really based on a rural setting. Most of the refugees that we deal with, for example, are generally put in a very remote, hard-to-reach part of the country. They're supposed to stay there, so we are supposed to work with them in those locations. We aren't generally set up properly for urban response. I'm sure other organizations may be better than us, but In terms of Kenya, I'm not very sure if we have an urban equivalent, for example, for the NDMA, which is mandated to coordinate. I believe that quite a lot of the work I'll talk about later that Concern has been leading and with others is now translated into some very positive coordination and leadership within Nairobi, so that's great to hear. But it's still quite new. As mentioned before, the vulnerable people in urban areas can be very hard to find. They often don't want to be found. They're very mobile, and they stay hidden because they're not supposed to be there, maybe. When we do surveys, we don't represent urban informal settlements properly. The population density is such that we often just overlook them or don't represent them adequately. Our tools and indicators are not geared to the urban context, and this all leads to a very weak response, if any, to those crises that do exist in the urban areas. We actually heard quite a lot about refugees, which I'm pleased to hear from the others. So I'll just very briefly go through this, and I know my colleague from the Refugee Council will talk more about the legal barriers to integration and so forth. But there is a great opportunity in Kenya for positive action towards integration of displaced people that can be capitalized on. But however, according to the ODI report, which just came out on looking at the progress of the comprehensive refugee response framework in Kenya and in other countries, there is currently no strategy within UNHCR for urban refugees. That's according to the report that came out just about a month ago, which I think shows the level that we still have to catch up to deal with this population. Sorry, that was supposed to be that slide. However, it's not all doom and gloom. There is knowledge and guidance out there. I'm just not sure if we're using it. And this speaks to the issue that the first speaker in the first panel raised about knowledge management. You know, there's a real need to properly share the kind of information that we are generating and that we do have. So I thought I would take an opportunity just to share some of the things I know that are out there. There was an initiative called the Stronger Cities Initiative, led by IIED, together with NRC, IRC World Vision. And this came up with a series of guidance, notes, toolkits, frameworks, and so forth on how to work in urban areas. This was finished around 2017, so it's not, it's still current. There's a list of different toolkits and guidance notes there that can be found. For example, these ones, which they first did a review of what needs assessment tools and frameworks we have for urban humanitarian response. Basically found that there weren't really any, or they needed to be drastically revised, and then came up with those lists of new guidance and frameworks. A particularly useful one that we used recently in Kampala was this urban multi-sector vulnerability assessment tool, which has been tailored to the urban context. Very simple things like when you do a food security survey, ask people, diet diversity. In the rural area, they pretty much eat what they grow or the few items that are available locally. But in an urban context, a lot of people eat out in restaurants. They won't know what is in those meals necessarily, and it could be a very different range of items. So these tools have been adapted to the urban context to be more relevant. Then there was this great project, which I'm going to shout to Concern worldwide. My previous colleagues in the Kenya program with OFDA support did a really fantastic piece of research also with Stanford University, looking at this question: how do we know when a situation has gone from chronic poverty to an acute crisis in an urban slum? Because this is the issue. We have so many people in these urban slums, but how do we know when it's reached the point where we have to actually mount a response? When is it bad enough that they actually do need life-saving assistance? This research went on over about 5 years, Jakob? Yeah, about 5 years. It was really detailed. It was really amazing looking at the urban slums around Nairobi. They identified that there are hotspots of extreme vulnerability within these slums that are much more vulnerable than others. People who have higher levels of vulnerability tend to cluster together. And they also tested a huge range of indicators to know which ones were more predictable, could better predict a crisis, sort of a health food security crisis, than others. Yeah. They found that there are very significant variations between slums, but also within. That a lot of our surveys and analysis frameworks like the IPC just don't get. They don't reflect those nuances between areas of higher vulnerability than others. They also found that female-headed households are disproportionately poor, and they tend to also cluster in those hotspots. So that this gender dynamic is really important. And that people have a very heavy reliance on negative coping strategies to meet their basic needs. And that's really a lot of protection issues there. So just quickly, the indicators that they came up with that can be tracked to predict an urban crisis are around livelihoods, expenditure, dependence on unsafe jobs, food security and nutrition, wash, health, personal security. As I said, I spoke to some of the researchers on this, and it's deeply shocking how people are living in these slums. And then coping mechanisms and what people are having to do in order to survive. So these are the set of indicators that can be used to track crises in the urban areas. And I think this is a really fantastic resource. It's had really good academic credentials behind it. We now can use this for early warning, and I think that it has been taken forward by the government and coalitions of agencies within Kenya to develop a strong and robust early warning system for the urban areas, which is great. I mean, just to highlight one of the differences, if you look at this, which I'm not sure if you can see, in terms of indicators, we have the famous 15% global acute malnutrition is an indicator of crisis. In an urban area, in a rural area, 15% is the crisis threshold. In this case, in Marsabit, it translates to 7,500 children in the county. In urban Nairobi, a GAM of 5.7%, which would be regarded as actually pretty good in a normal rural context, actually translates to 22,000 acutely malnourished children. The indicators that we use do not apply to rural settings, and that's why they need to be adapted. So we've also done a bit of work around the region. As I said, the IDMC on the left is doing studies. This one is in Mogadishu, looking at urban displacement, where many people have been displaced repeatedly and having to move, forced evictions, repeated shocks, ethnic clashes, all of that. And then we also did a study in Kampala, urban areas amongst refugees and host communities, to look at vulnerability levels and what the needs were that we could start addressing. Sorry, I have one more, this is the last one. So based on all those other people's work, there are some key recommendations that we all need to perhaps consider when working in urban areas. There needs to be a recognition of urban vulnerability and a refocus on it, to recognize it's different from rural vulnerability, the levels, the indicators, and all of that. Resilience in the urban context is really important. That point's been made a few times, and this really urgent need to integrate humanitarian development frameworks, actors come together and work, but also to make markets work for the poorest. People don't tend to grow their food in the urban areas. They do most things they purchase. Those markets need to be able to be working for the poor people, available to them. The importance of national engagement, and I would add leadership, policy work, resource allocation, and integration of these urban early warning systems. I think Kenya has a really good example in Nairobi that you can talk to people at concern about. The surge models that Peter mentioned to reinforce existing systems when a crisis does hit or is identified. We don't want to go in and set up a parallel system. We need to build those existing ones. We also need to recategorize what constitutes an acute crisis. As mentioned with the nutrition example, this is not the same in an urban area. The numbers of people are different. The thresholds we have in our sphere standards don't apply necessarily, and we need to really get together and agree how we're going to identify these crises. And finally, the same message that we have to be better coordinated and really focus on preparedness so that we are able to face this growing challenge that we know is coming. We know it's coming, and we have to be better able to deal with it. That's it. Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
Thank you. A lot of content and a nice summary for further action and research. Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Eunice Ndonga Gitinji. She is the Executive Director of the Refugee Consortium in Kenya. And of course, we will shift to the last topic that many of us already mentioned, the question of visibility, access, existence of the refugees, the migrants in urban setting. What's the situation here, and what have you been able to do, and what's your recommendation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Let me give you just one or two sentences about who RCK is. RCK is a legal and advocacy organization. Sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. We were established in 1998 purely to look at forced migrant issues in Kenya and the region. And we work to safeguard rights and dignity of forced migrants. We have offices in Nairobi, in the camps, and in Garissa. I just want to give a bit of a context with regard to refugee protection and IDP protection in Kenya, just for us to appreciate the magnitude of those that are living in urban settings. We all are aware that Kenya has hosted refugees for many years. In fact, we have refugees who have lived here for more than 3 decades. We currently host about 474,000, and most of these are in the 2 refugee camps of Dadaab and Kakuma. But we also know that a significant number live in Nairobi, about slightly above 70,000. But it's also estimated that a similar number lives in Nairobi in what I would call either illegally or invisibly. So that is double invisibility, in the sense that these are refugees who are meant to be living in the camps, and for you to live outside the camps, you need to have a legal authority to do so. But there are also those who cannot manage to live there, so they move illegally, and because of that, they do not have any documents allowing them to stay in Nairobi. We also know that a number of others live in other towns, like Garissa, Kajiado, Mombasa, Nakuru, and Eldoret. However, we only have 2 registration centers, now in the camps and in Nairobi. What does that mean for those who are living outside Nairobi as a city? We also practice encampment policy. I think we all know that. And because of that, as I said, it is illegal to live outside the camp without documentation. That authorization is not easy to find. And we find many refugees who are traveling from the camps to the urban centers being arrested by police officers, and they are charged with either living outside designated areas or with illegal presence. Let me just highlight some of the reasons why refugees come to the cities. One is family reunification. You'll find that a member of the family is in the camp, 3 other members are in different towns in Kenya, and so they come to towns in search of their families. Others are coming for protection reasons, others for education, others for employment. But the greatest challenge we see is that when they arrive in the cities, assume like Nairobi, they don't have a place to stay. Remember, we have said that urban refugees have not been recognized in Kenya. So they will end up in the slums. And there, the question we always ask ourselves as a legal aid organization, when people learn to come to a country like Kenya, they come for protection. So when they go to live in the informal settlement, where they cannot access any resources, they cannot access material support, there is no housing, is that protection. So I think that is a question that we need to be asking ourselves moving forward. In terms of IDPs who face the same challenges as refugees, but at risk they are in their own country, we have about 162,000 Kenyans who are living in displacement as of December 2018. But I want to pinpoint that this is from IDMC. I think from our government perspective, naturally we see IDPs as those who are from the post-election violence in 2007 and 2008. So in essence, those that have been displaced by floods, by drought, once the emergency phase has ended, they kind of become invisible, and we no longer are focusing at them. The lack of official IDP numbers, particularly in the urban areas, hampers any assistance that would be due to them beyond the emergency phase, including legal aid assistance. We have a number of legal frameworks that support IDPs and refugees. I won't go to the many that we have, but the greatest challenge we have seen is implementation. I don't think that refugees and IDPs suffer in the slums or in the urban areas, particularly because we don't have enough laws that would protect them, but it's poor implementation. Let me delve into the specifics in terms of the challenges, and then I'll look at what does Unhcr do to address these challenges. Our support is revolving allowed access to rights and services for those in urban areas. And remember, like for refugees, the question of informal or the principle of non-return is very critical to refugee protection. But yet we see that majority of refugees and asylum seekers do not have documentation. They lack most rights because of that. And of course, they are at risk of being arrested, like I have said. The LSD process in Kenya is very lengthy, sometimes taking 2, 3, 5 years. In fact, right now we have asylum seekers maybe who have appointment letters dating to 2021. What does that mean in terms of access to services? These are people who cannot access services. They are also people who are at risk of being arrested for being in Kenya illegally. And that is a criminal offense that attracts a jail term and also attracts a fine. So that becomes very challenging even for institutions like Unhcr that offer legal services. Remember that for those who live in urban areas, the policy is that those are ones who are able to take care of themselves. But we are also saying that they are living in formal settlements where vulnerabilities are very high. They are unable to access livelihoods. They cannot access work permits. They cannot move freely. They are also unable to access medical, housing, and all other social amenities. So these are people who are facing very great challenges. And even as humanitarian actors, we need to ask ourselves, what is the plight of urban refugees, and particularly those in the slum areas? I want to quickly talk about the issue of high levels of gender-based violence. A number of my colleagues have already talked about the challenges that the urban refugees are facing. Levels of SGBV are very high among refugees and IDPs. Many of them many women and girls end up working as domestic maids when they come to the city. Some act as waitresses. Others choose negative coping mechanisms. It's okay to work as a domestic worker, but in what conditions? Many of them go through sexual violence in those working relations, and in many instances, they are not paid because they have nowhere to go. We have had instances where refugees come for legal cause. They come and they say they were violated by their employers, but they don't have a contract. They don't have an employment letter. they have no documentation to show that they are working for that person. So even in terms of access to justice, how do you help such a person? And then the other things we have seen is misconceptions about who IDPs or refugees are. In many cases, you will find that when there is a crisis, for instance, when there is an emergency, refugees will be, or IDPs will be double displaced. But while Kenyans can quickly look for their relations in the rural areas or in other cities, these are people who have nowhere to go. So when they are double displaced, it becomes very challenging even to offer legal assistance, because you have to start from the very basic of all the rights have been violated. They don't even have a place to stay, and even where to, if the option was to return them to the camps, they ran away from the camps because they are unable to live in the camps. So you can imagine that kind of a challenge, a humanitarian challenge. So, and in case of a fight, or in case of violence in the urban areas, the refugee is easily blamed. I remember a case where two young people fought. One was a refugee and the other one was a Kenyan. And in the process, the Kenyan was hurt. But then the whole neighborhood went against the refugees, saying that, you see, these are the people who are fighting our own. They are also taking jobs from our own. And because of that, then it becomes very challenging. So what do we do as RCK? We provide free legal advice, education, and direct representation. This is, in all cases, related to asylum. If people don't have documentation, helping them fast track, helping them draft legal documents, but also in areas, in cities where we don't have a presence, we use pro bono advocates in those areas, but we also do border monitoring and community monitoring, especially in the slums, to ensure that refugees are able to access, and IDPs are able to access resources that are due to them. We also support them to prepare for interviews, but also we do public interest litigation. I'm finishing. Public interest litigation, where we challenge or we request the courts to determine cases on behalf of refugees. For instance, during the Usalama Wash, there were many children that were separated with families, and RCK with others went to court to challenge the constitutionality of that. I think moving forward in terms of what needs to be done, we need to be deliberate about access to justice for displaced populations. Normally what we see is that sometimes legal protection is almost subsumed by the emergency phase, because people need to have food, people need to have shelter, people need to have all those basic things. But if people don't have lights, if people cannot access legal justice, then even if someone was hungry and her daughter has been violated, it doesn't make sense. So I think we need to be very deliberate to ensure that access to justice is integrated in all phases. And finally, I think we need to strengthen policy influencing to ensure that we have strong legal framework that can support freedom of movement, that can support integration, that can support resilience building for those that have been forced to free, and particularly for urban caseload that is completely invisible. And finally, to also have a strategy, a strong protection response, and particularly addressing gender-based violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So now Professor Fike would try to summarize and give his perspective on it. And I think it's not a present to ask an historian to comment on current issues, but he's also an anthropologist, so I'm sure he will manage the challenge very, very clearly. So please try to give a counterpoint to what we heard, and before we open the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. It's quite a challenge indeed. But I will try my best to discuss some perspectives out of the presentation. Nafurahi sana kuanani nyote leo kwa mkutano huu. Nashukuru msalaba mwekundu wa Kenya kwa kukaribisha kwake. Na shukrani kwa masemaji. Na kusema Kiswahili kidogo. I could talk in English, but I have understood that the interpreters in the cabins are getting bored translating from English to French. And I invite you to use your headphones and upload the language worker for their work. And I will shift to the French language so that they can also change the activities in their brain. Ça a été déjà mentionné, je suis historien, venant de l'anthropologie et aussi de la philologie, l'étude des textes. Je ne travaille pas dans le champ de l'humanitaire, mais dans celui des humanités. Il y a un lien entre les deux termes qui nous renvoie à l'humain, à la compréhension de l'humain dans son unité morale, son unité physique aussi, malgré la diversité des expressions culturelles. La ressource principale des humanités est l'étude des langues, afin de pouvoir comprendre les spécificités de chaque langue en même temps que leur universalité intrinsèque, parce que chaque langue fonctionne sur les mêmes bases cognitives du même cerveau que nous partageons toutes et tous. Dans mon rôle de discutant, j'ai essayé ainsi d'être attentif au vocabulaire employé par chacun des intervenants, même si toutes les contributions étaient en anglais, ça aurait été plus riche dans différentes langues. Et je commencerai ainsi par une comparaison entre le français et le kiswahili. En français, la relation entre ville et village est similaire à celle entre mji et kijiji en kiswahili. On passe de ville à village, on rajoute le suffixe age. En kiswahili, on passe de mji à kijiji, donc on redouble jiji. Et c'est une question d'échelle, des zones habitées de différentes tailles. Ce terme générique de zone habitée correspond en anglais, on l'a beaucoup entendu, au terme de settlement, qui décrit un endroit où l'on s'installe, où l'on s'implante. Mais le sens de settlement en anglais est plus riche que le simple fait de settle. C'est aussi une zone où l'on peut habiter dès que les conflits sont settled, sont réglés, dès que des compromis sont trouvés, settled. Le settlement, donc, désigne plus que le fait d'habiter. Le settlement est un acte de pacification qui permet l'implantation. C'est un mot difficile à traduire en français. Je ne sais pas comment les traducteurs s'en sont sortis. On dira une zone habitée, de l'habitat informel pour informal settlement. D'ailleurs, on parlera difficilement, que ce soit en anglais ou en français, de formal settlement. On dira settlement tout court, mais on ne parlera pas d'habitat formel ou d'habitat formalisé. Peut-être plutôt de zones urbanisées ou urbaines, désignant un autre type de processus, j'y reviendrai. Donc on voit que se joue dans ces jeux d'échelle, dans ce passage de la ville au village, du village à la ville, des changements de statut, des gradations dans la nomination. Il s'agit d'échelle spatiale, mais aussi d'échelle de valeur. Revenons au village. Dans le monde romain antique, en langue latine, la villa désigne une ferme. A country house, a rural property. Un village est non seulement un ensemble d'habitations, un settlement, mais aussi un ensemble de fermes, d'unités de production qui se partagent la ressource foncière. En français, le suffixe age désigne une activité dérivée, vision, visionnage, pâture, pâturage, gare, garage, ainsi de suite. Dans un sens, c'est le village qui produit la ville. La ville, constituée, formelle, est le résultat d'opérations informelles, d'expérimentations qui se jouent au niveau des villages, des settlements, des places to be settled. Continuons avec l'anglais, qui est une langue composite, assez instable et bizarre dans son caractère composite, et ce qui a sans doute favorisé sa diffusion. L'allemand est beaucoup plus logique et conséquent, mais finalement assez peu diffusé. L'anglais a conservé le terme latin français de village. Mais il n'y a pas de lien de continuité sémantique en anglais entre village et town pour la ville. La rupture est plus nette en anglais, en langue anglaise, entre le milieu urbain et le milieu rural, sans doute. Tandis que la ville ou le mji en Kiswahili sont des villages qui ont réussi, qui ont prospéré, qui se sont densifiés et étendus pour former des agglomérations, des villages ou des paroisses. Le town désigne un autre type de processus. La délimitation, l'encerclement, la fermeture, c'est l'étymologie du terme dans les langues germaniques. Ce caractère ségrégué du town est exprimé dans le terme anglais, aujourd'hui, finalement, qui est passé d'usage, le terme de township, qui est une division, un district, mais dans le contexte sud-africain, en est venu par désigner la ségrégation des populations en milieu urbain, la ségrégation de l'apartheid. Et le terme de town est porteur de ce sens de ségrégation fermée. Qu'en est-il d'un autre terme qu'on entend beaucoup et qui fait un peu le pont entre le français et l'anglais, urbain, urban. C'est juste un adjectif dans les deux langues, qui vient pourtant d'un mot, urbs en latin, qui désigne la ville. Alors, urbs, c'est un peu comme town. Urbs, c'est étymologiquement un enclos. Cependant, avec l'usage contemporain du terme urbain ou urban, c'est plus imprécis, c'est plus fluctuant, c'est à la fois fermé et ouvert. Le urban laisse des espaces de circulation, de filtrage. Ça laisse la place à des acteurs politiques, économiques, sociaux pour entreprendre, des espaces d'initiative pour transformer le toddy, le slum, en quartier, pour passer du slum au livelihood, et du livelihood au neighborhood, et du neighborhood à la city, un autre terme encore, qu'on n'a pas beaucoup entendu finalement. Cité, ça désigne aussi un ensemble fermé sur lui-même, constitué, historique. C'est aussi ce qu'on appelle le centre-ville, le premier noyau urbain. C'est le cœur de la ville qui définit son identité. Ce terme est dérivé du latin civitas, qui est un ensemble de citoyens qui forment une communauté sur la base d'une reconnaissance collective de la dignité vis de chacun. Qui vis, c'est le fait d'être chacun dans sa dignité individuelle, mais ensemble, et de le reconnaître en tant que tel. C'est ce sens qui s'exprime aussi à un certain niveau dans neighborhood, qui désigne une proximité de fait entre des gens qui habitent au même endroit. Mais neighborhood n'implique pas une égalité de reconnaissance, de statut. Neighborhood peut intégrer dans sa compréhension des formes d'inégalité de statut. Tandis que la cité, la citadinité, implique un lien citoyen, une égalité sur le plan politique. Dans les cités d'aujourd'hui, les relations de civilité sont un enjeu majeur. Le débat politique français est totalement pollué, paralysé par des questions d'identité, alors que la civilité, le fait de vivre ensemble, le fait de reconnaître la dignité de chacun est trop exclu du débat politique. Quelle est l'extension de la civilité? Quelles sont ses dynamiques? Quelles sont les capacités d'innovation dans les relations civiles portées par les acteurs citoyens pour dépasser les ségrégations de fait de la ville, de la town? Alors, je terminerai par un terme un peu étonnant, mais qui participe des dynamiques de création urbaine. C'est la paroisse, ou parish en anglais, qui conserve une étymologie intéressante. L'adjectif anglais, parochial, renvoie clairement au grec parokia, qui désigne ceux qui habitent à côté, paro, pas à côté l'un de l'autre, qui habitent à côté, les exclus, les étrangers, ceux qui n'ont pas le droit de citer, les réfugiés, les gens de passage. Il en a été beaucoup question dans le panel. Au sens étymologique, les paroissiens sont les gens des taudis, des slums, celles et ceux qui se heurtent aux parois des portes de la ville, qui supplient de pouvoir y entrer, d'y jouir de mêmes droits. L'histoire des églises est celle d'un effort collectif, d'une ambition utopique à l'échelle universelle pour passer à l'échelle de l'humanité entière, de la paroisse des exclus, des gens en transit dans ce monde, à la cité céleste de l'au-delà. Le travail humanitaire ne vise pas l'au-delà, mais bien les gens de ce monde, les exclus de ce monde, et même les citadins inclus de ce monde, afin d'intégrer les exclus, les demandeurs d'asile, les gens de passage. Nous sommes tous en passage dans ce monde, tous en transit, et il s'agit de réaménager à toutes les échelles des nouveaux lieux de transit, et dans ces lieux de transit, des nouvelles formes de transitivité, de civilité, de citadinité et de citoyenneté mondiale. Asante kwa umakini wenu. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. I think we've been brought to another level. Thank you very much for this. I'll still have one question. I mean, there's one word that we hear a lot in Nairobi. You've not mentioned it. It's estate. Where do you put it? And I'll have a private conversation on that, because for me it's still not clear as a non-Nairobian what does it mean estate nowadays. After this, I think we still have a few minutes for a few questions or remarks on the challenge of urbanization here in Kenya and the role of humanitarian action in urban settings. And there's some practitioners in the room, some maybe have other reflection than the one that will be put. So please, I'll take 3, and then we'll see what time it is after those ones. 1, 2, and 3. Yeah. So I'll leave you for the next round. Okay. Please.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentations. Dan Olago, University of Nairobi. Given the context of devolution, we are seeing very rapid growth in the headquarters of the counties, which are in arid and semi-arid lands. Those towns are growing much faster than any of the projections I've seen for 2009 up to this point in time. And in fact, I think their growth rate is much higher than the 4% for Nairobi. It is probably about 7%. And they don't have the infrastructure that is needed. So while we are looking to respond in many ways to things like floods and droughts, to changing climate, to building resilience, we are allowing development to proceed without taking into account any of those aspects. So are we working against, are we really, wasting our time? That's the big question.
Thank you. Second question, please.
No, yeah. Yeah, it's as a follow-up, in fact, as a comment of Dan. So you start from the devoluted system, you go to something more involuted in cities, town, and is there some documentation or reporting on the question of land? I think somebody mentioned this problem of land, access to land, in fact several underline this problem of access to land in the urban areas for the poor. And is there a continuum between this problem of land access with the original the area of departure of these people, of these refugees? And is there some research which has been taken or undertaken, on this question of access to land and mobility from rural vulnerable areas to peri-urban, very vulnerable areas?
Thank you. Question is noted. The third one before we return to the panel.
Thank you. Merci. Moi, c'est M. Youssouf Daouda. Je viens de la République du Bénin, en Afrique de l'Ouest. Merci à tous les panélistes et merci aussi à pour la philologie. Je ne sais pas si c'est le philologue ou le philologiste pour nous avoir plongé dans cette sémantique de ces mots. Mais je me pose la question, pourquoi distinguer l'humanitaire de l'humanité? Pourquoi ne pas être humanitaire et être pour l'humanité? Mais qu'est-ce que vous voulez dire concrètement? Parlant du contexte dans lequel nous sommes en train de débattre, les personnes vulnérables, les personnes démunies, serait-il judicieux de parler de l'humanité ou de l'humanitaire de ce point de vue? Merci.
Merci. Donc, j'ouvre la parole au panel pour répondre. Qui veut se lancer? Who wants to start with a... Mrs. Wainoni, yes.
I'll answer the question on the counties developing too rapidly. And then the other question on peri-urban areas and migration, my colleague Sina, who is seated here, will answer. So the issue of the county developing too rapidly that the counties are not able to cope, I think that is an area that planning has to come in strongly and be proactive instead of reactive. And the good thing is that planning has been devolved in Kenya to counties. And with support from the national government, I think there's a way they can work together and come up with a way to coordinate and to proactively plan better, and also lose some rigidness and be flexible in terms of like the uses that they have set, the acreage and the development, the control. They need to be more flexible and realistic so that they actually address the needs of the people and are able to meet the needs. My colleague can talk about migration from rural to peri-urban areas.
Yes, thank you. My name is Sina Schlimm and I'm also a colleague of Agatha. So thanks for the very relevant question on documentation actually on access to land in peri-urban areas. So peri-urban areas have gray zones in terms of land governance, land administration, land tenure regimes, and there are also a bit of gray zones in terms of research. There are things which are being done from the academic point of view. There's lots of writings on land use transformations, especially. Less is being done on migration, even though there is a growing awareness, I would say, also from, let's say, researchers with an impact-oriented approach. So there's the Overseas Development Institute, ODI, which has produced an important report on this. And we are also currently at the Global Land Tool Network at UN Habitat. I'm doing a bit of advertisement, developing a research on peri-urban, access to land in peri-urban areas in East Africa. So if you want, I can send you a couple of specific reports. Yeah, thanks.
Other panelists wants to comment on the question raised?
I just wanted to mention something aloud. Rapid growth in the headquarters of devolved government. I think we can utilize the Constitution to support the planning of the counties. First, you can imagine these are counties that resources have been devolved and people are struggling to know what to do with these resources. But there is what is provided for in the Constitution about public participation, and also if the people themselves are used or are asked to talk about prioritization, what their needs are. I think it would help in terms of ensuring that development is people-centered and it is meeting the needs of the people, and that is already provided for in the Constitution. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll try I love the question about why do we talk about humanitarian and not just humanity? I don't know, good question. I also wonder why we still talk about humanitarian and development as if they're two different things that don't meet somewhere in the middle. You're right, especially in the urban poor areas and these sort of high density settlements. There's often very little difference actually in living conditions between people. They cluster together. We see time and again that displaced people and their hosts have very similar conditions. Sometimes the hosts are actually worse off than the displaced in certain times. And I think it is about, recognizing the humanity in each and every one of those people and the fact that they have the right to a better life than that, and that we have the resources to try to help them to do that. Governments have that mandate. Agencies with resources to do that have that mandate. So I think it's a great question, and I think we should think more about the humanity in all of this and put ourselves in those people's shoes sometimes. So thanks.
So if you allow me, I will floor for maybe this last question, because we're coming to the end of the time. So the two last questions, 1 and 2, and then maybe a final word from the discussant.
Okay, thank you. I'm Serge Junton. My first question is about, I would rather like Madame Eunice to answer that question. So it's, as you deal with urban refugee, and you know that the refugee in urban area can influence the local economies or their local their general economies. So have you ever conducted any research about the way that those refugees can influence Kenya economy? Otherwise, I would like to have a discussion with you. So the second question is to François. Oh, no. Oh, Éloi. So, vous avez dit que c'est le village qui produit la ville, mais que voulez-vous dire par là? Est-ce que ça dit que c'est le village qui se développe pour devenir une ville, ou bien c'est ceux qui sont au village qui vont en ville? Merci.
And the last one.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. I have a small question. I'm a little worried about the numbers and statistics, particularly in the urban areas vis-a-vis the rurals. This is because one of the attractions, in my understanding, one of the attractions of devolution was really that it would help decongest the urban areas, the cities. Is it possible that we are not having up-to-date statistics about, say, Nairobi vis-a-vis the 47 counties that our Constitution created, and that there's room for more nuanced look at some of these numbers? Because I don't know how you get the statistics, say, for the informal settlements and so on. whether we get accurate and reliable ones, particularly from the KMBS.
Thank you. The panel, anyone having comments on the two sets of questions, the one on the economy and a contribution to the economy, and the other one, okay, are we getting the statistics right, or there's a vacuum currently to make the proper analysis?
I can start with the first question on refugees' contribution to the economies. Of course, refugees are contributing to the economy of this country. We have a number of studies that have been done, both in the camps and in the urban areas, linking their contribution to the economy of the country. Unfortunately, in terms of legal contribution, that has not been fully recognized, because they do not access work permits easily, and only a very small number does access that. But in the camps, they are thriving economies run by refugees themselves. And moving forward, we are looking at ensuring that this contribution is made legal. And that is why we are currently reviewing the Refugee Act 2006 to see whether we can ensure refugee contribution to the economy of this country is well recognized, where refugees can even be able to pay taxes, to be able also to contribute in a legal sense to the economy of the country. So, but in terms of studies, they are there that demonstrate that refugees do contribute and are able to contribute to the economy of the country. I think we can have that discussion after this.
Yes, I'll take the question on the numbers. I think my sources, maybe Sarah might have the same sources, was the UNDSA urbanization prospects that give projections, mostly based on what is current and simulated using the rates that are predicted. But I would also want to go to the next question about devolution and making the rural areas attractive. I think we might have missed the boat a bit, because devolution just created 46 other cities at a smaller scale than Nairobi that are centers of attraction. So there might be a bit of migration from Nairobi and the older cities to those new areas, but we are still modeling the growth after Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, Nakuru, where we are concentrating on the city, but the rural area is still marginalized in a way. And we are not helping matters, because we are making rural areas look very unattractive to the young people by telling them become farmers and I don't know what, and they don't want to be farmers. So unless there's a policy that really supports the economies in rural areas so that it keeps people grounded, because we are moving for economical reasons, not for fun. If rural areas can remain attractive, then I think we'll solve a bit of the problem of slums, and especially in the newer cities. For Nairobi, I think it requires a totally different discussion on how to deal with the slums. But for the newer towns, it might take quite a bit of time for us to start seeing the negative outward migration from Nairobi to those areas once we start moving industry, manufacturing into the 46 new county headquarters.
Thank you. Final, maybe word, village, ville, Greenwich Village in the mega city. What's...
C'était pour vous amuser un peu, principalement, et pour vous inviter à réfléchir au sens des catégories usuelles, tellement usuelles qu'elles sont usées. Et donc c'est toujours bien de revenir au sens commun, pour essayer de challenger, comme on dit, ces catégories de sens. Oui, le village produit la ville. Et à travers cela, il s'agit de réfléchir sur les opérations qui se jouent dans les noms, les opérations de sens anciennes qui ont eu une histoire partagée. Le village est une unité d'activité, une unité de production, et la ville et l'assemblage d'activités multiples, compatibles les unes avec les autres et qui forment une attractivité. Et cela incite peut-être à considérer le rôle, l'activité, l'utilité que chacun peut avoir dans un espace urbain, dans une ville produite par des villages, tandis que le settlement est simplement un habitat, un camp. Le village est une activité et il s'agit aussi de reconnaître cette activité, ce rôle à chacun.
Merci. Thank you. So I'd like to thank once more the panelists discussing for this last session. Thank you very much for your contribution.